let's talk about
a T-shirt just for this.
Let's talk about Terri's new T-shirt she did buy just for this, and the brand of it all, and getting more looks into the past. This is building upon stuff we talked about last week, clearly, but the Tower of Joy.
Don't worry about it. I only wrote 1,900 words about this.
Yeah.
I delved real deep. I would argue that this might have been one of the most important tidbits of information Game of Thrones, the show, has ever given to us. And again, we've talked a lot about this. I can go on forever about it. But I think a really important point that people haven't talked about, given the context of the vision, is why did the Three-Eyed Raven show this to Bran?
Right.
And, Isaac Hempstead Wright did an interview with The Hollywood Reporter last week where he said the Three-Eyed Raven is specifically showing Bran glimpses into the past. It's not like they just are happening upon these places, and Bran isn't choosing them. They're being brought there for a reason. And I think that it's really interesting that Bran not only see that, like, it's sort of like a bait and switch, because everyone can say, oh, well, it's showing to Bran that his father wasn't as honorable as he thought. I have this quote from David Benioff and Dan Weiss from the Inside the Episode that played after that I thought was really interesting. They said it was important to break down the myth of Ned Stark, and this is the quote. Ned was completely ready to let go of that honor and excellence to do something that he felt was more important. That could make a very, very strong defense for Ned doing what he did. And that line is in reference to Ned lying about how Sir Arthur Dayne died, but I think it could just as easily be used to apply to the theory that what's up in the tower is Lyanna Stark, and that she's giving birth to a baby, and there's this big theory that I stand by being true, that that baby would end up being Jon Snow.
Sure. And there was a lot of talk about were we hearing a baby crying up there,
right? Or just like her crying out.
Yeah. I definitely think that all it's getting closer and closer to that, and it was funny because it was really exciting for people to see this flashback, and then there was like the agony of like, no, they cut away from it. Bran should have been like, wait, I think they're gonna finally reveal this thing.
Well, I think it's interesting that Bran doesn't see it and the audience doesn't either.
Right.
And people were frustrated with that because they didn't get to find out, but I think it's interesting that it's setting up that the Three-Eyed Raven is saying, no, you can only see so much. Why didn't he show more? Will Bran break ranks and go and see? Like, I think we'll almost certainly find out what happened in that tower this season, and that Bran might go back on his own. But also really interesting to note that there's that moment where Bran calls out father to Ned. Ned seems to hear him, and right after that happens, the camera cuts to the Three-Eyed Raven, and he has a look of like almost fear on his face.
Yeah.
And we know that like Bran isn't supposed to be able to change the past, but maybe can he? Is he more powerful than people think?
That was a really big moment, I thought, to me, like to include that at all. And of course, the Three-Eyed Raven kind of like tries to pass it off as like, whatever, he just heard something.
Yeah.
There's a wind. But yeah, I think they were definitely sort of showing that Bran, there was something there. Ned did hear him. That's kind of a huge thing to throw into this. Like if Bran can actually in some way, first of all, it says a lot about Bran and his sort of power ability, but even for the show, for Game of Thrones, to not just do glimpses into the past, but do the idea that you can somehow affect it. And that, Bran can Marty McFly his way into something or other. And I don't think it'll be that dramatic as far as like, I don't think Bran will suddenly be like walking around having conversations.
Does he use that for good or evil?
Right.
I think is interesting, because Bran is always a character who I thought could go the other way, could not necessarily be a good guy.
I don't think he'd be like consciously evil or like, I'm going to do something dark, but I do think it'll be about the, there's always the idea of like, should you affect change in this way? But I think I feel like Game of Thrones in time travel stories, but I think in Game of Thrones it'll be more like this is what always happened, and no one's going to see him like fully 3D in front of them, like, oh, who's this, teenager?
Can he manipulate
but can
something?
they somewhat hear him? Can he somewhat be manipulating events to kind of go a certain way? I think that might be where they're going.
I also think it's interesting, and this is an assumption and knowledge that there is a baby up there, that it is Jon Snow. Most of the people involved in this storyline are dead. I think Helen Reed is alive on the show, but this is the first time he's Jojen and Mira's father, and this is the first time we would have seen him. Now, unless Helen told Mira about the fact that there was this baby, which there is a chance that that was the case. It's certainly implied a little bit in the books, but say that's not the case and there is no Howland, Bran could be the only person with the knowledge of the fact there was this baby and it's Jon. What does he do with that?
Right.
I think that's a really interesting question. Does he just go to Castle Black and meet up with Jon and, you know,
so Jon's not there.
Well, yeah, but like fight at his side.
Yeah.
Like, does he go to someone else with this knowledge? Like, does the Night's King somehow get it? It seems like the Night's King is very interested in Jon Snow. But yeah, like the fact that Jon is half Targaryen isn't really known to many people. So what do the people with that knowledge do with it?
Right.
I think is like a big question people haven't necessarily been thinking about.
I also want to say, sort of in defense of the show, because I saw people that were like, you know, I joked about like the agony of them cutting away, but there's some people who are just pissed about it, like, oh, what are you doing? You're holding off on this more. But it's really hard for us all, you know, Terry and I sitting here, but I know a lot of people who are like super like analyzing Game of Thrones, especially people who read the books, just to divorce themselves from the fact that people that are just watching the show. And it was funny watching that episode with my wife because she loves Game of Thrones, but she hasn't read the books and she doesn't go on websites, she doesn't speculate. So she was kind of like, wait, what's happening here with this flashback? And I think that's one of the reasons they're being slow to reveal it, is because it's an info dump for people who aren't immersed in this stuff. And there's a reason even in the flashback, in the previously on, they're like, they showed stuff from the pilot, but they even cut to a shot of Robert because that guy was in the first 4 episodes of the show, and you kind of have to remind people who all these people are. So there's a whole lot of people watching Game of Thrones who are just not like, you know, as hyper analyzing as a lot of us are, that I think that's like, it would be a lot to, in like one episode, one, you know, flashback, be like, here's all this stuff. And I think I don't want them, now that they've introduced this first half kind of the flashback, I don't want them to wait, you know, 2 more years to show the rest.
I agree. And I do think, you know, sort of
there's a reason for it.
The other side of what you're saying is there are people who are like, oh, if this is what happens, like if this is who Jon Snow's parents are, which if you remember, like when George R. R. Martin first sat down with David Benioff and Dan Weiss, he asked them, who are Jon Snow's parents? They answered correctly. That's why they got to make the show.
Yes.
It's a big deal. I think people are like, if it happens the way everyone thinks it happens, that's bad. That's not good storytelling. I think it's great storytelling. The reason why I and so many people are obsessed with this theory is because in the books and in the show too, they've done a good job in the show. It's been so cleverly written into what's happened. It builds up, and that moment when it clicks for you and you're like, wait, what is the subtext that I've been missing this whole time? And you go back and you puzzle it out. It's just like mind-blowing. It's so well done. And I think the fact that you can go back to the pilot of this show and see the groundwork being laid there, and you really can trace it throughout the entire series to if and when it pays off, I think is great. And even though people figured it out and people like me break down the theory for other people who might not know, I still think it's great storytelling.
I agree. And it's like, yeah, because it would be almost like, think about how ridiculous it would be if after all this, it was like, oh no, the story Ned told was just the truth. It was like Jon Snow's mom was just some lady. No,
Shara Dane or whoever.
Yeah. At a certain point, it's like, no. It's fine that they've built this. They've built this framework upon it, and they're now delivering. And it's almost like, you know, the excitement people had. I know it's a weird analogy, but when people who had read the books are just excited to see like a red wedding moment happen, just because like, oh, we're getting to this moment I've been waiting for. You can say that about like the reveal of Jon Snow's parents, even if we're right, and it's pretty much what many fans have guessed. There's still excitement and sort of like, okay, they're going to finally verbalize this all. They're going to finally lay it out there.
I do want to say too, like I have my R plus L equals J shirt on right now, but there is this other theory that I've never been especially crazy about, but I think that there's good evidence for it. That is R plus J or R plus L equals J and M, or Jon and Mira, because Mira is supposed to be the same age as Jon Snow. Like, could Ned and Howland Reed each have come back with the baby to raise? There have been a couple interesting comments with Mira this year about how like Bran needs her and how she is responsible for like going with him on his journey and all this other stuff. I could see that twist coming. I think that muddies the waters a little bit.
I don't think it's necessary.
I don't think it's necessary, but we do know there's supposed to be like 3 heads of the dragon. There's supposed to be 3 Targaryens out there. Dany has 3 dragons. Could Mira be the 3rd? Maybe. I still don't love it, but like,
right.
I wouldn't be mad. Mira's great.
She is. She's just chilling outside, waiting for Bran.
She's hanging out with Summer.
Yeah, Summer. Oh, Summer. Hope
R.I.P.
you make it
Shaggy
there.
Dog.
Yes.